In 1986, the Rocky Mountains of Colorado were enduring one of the harshest winters in memory. The snow fell so thick it erased all traces of life, turning the vast forest into a blank, perilous expanse. The wind howled like an unseen creature's scream, carrying a cold that seeped into every wooden fiber of the small cabin standing isolated amidst the wilderness. This was the home of Ethan Harper, a veteran ranger who had lived here for many years. Though sturdy, the cabin seemed diminutive against the wrath of nature. Ethan Harper, nearing 50, was neither young nor old. His face bore the marks of time, cold winds, and countless solitary nights in the forest. His salt and pepper beard added to his rugged yet contemplative appearance. He was unmarried, with no family, save for his loyal companion, Max, an aging hunting dog. Max, with his graying fur, had been with Ethan since he was just a pup. His legs were weary, but his eyes remained sharp, constantly scanning for the faintest of sounds in the winter night. That evening, Ethan sat by the fireplace, the flickering flames casting dancing shadows across his face. A small notebook rested in his hands as he jotted down weather observations, a daily ritual not for pay but out of duty to the forest he protected. The crackling of the firewood was the only sound breaking the silence. Apart from the occasional whistle of the wind outside, Max lay curled at Ethan's feet, eyes half closed but ears alert, listening for anything out of the ordinary. The weather today was especially unforgiving. A snowstorm loomed, powerful enough to uproot ancient trees. Ethan had spent the morning preparing, securing windows, checking the woodpile, and ensuring the radio was operational. Yet, even with his meticulous precautions, the storm filled him with unease, not for himself, but for the creatures struggling to survive beyond the warmth of his cabin. Suddenly, a strange sound broke through the wind's howl, a faint scratching at the wooden door. Ethan's hand froze mid-sentence, his pen pausing on the notebook. His eyes narrowed, scanning the room as Max sprang to attention, ears pricked and fur bristling. A low growl rumbled from the old dog's throat. The scratching wasn't loud but persistent, like a feeble hand knocking for help. Ethan rose, reaching for his rifle from its mount on the wall. He wasn't unfamiliar with the peculiarities of the forest, but every incident demanded caution. His hand hesitated on the doorknob as he listened. The wind still screamed, but the scratching persisted. Slowly, he unlatched the door, cracking it open just enough to peer outside. At first, all he saw was snow, thick and swirling in the dim twilight. The wind lashed against his face, forcing him to squint. Then, a small shadow emerged, barely discernible against the white expanse. Ethan opened the door wider, and the light from inside spilled out, revealing the shape of a fox. His fiery red coat stood out against the snow, though it was matted with ice and dirt. The fox was gaunt, its eyes wide with fear but locked on Ethan's. It didn't flee as most animals would. Instead, it stood its ground, almost as if pleading for help. Ethan's brows knitted together as he stepped outside to get a closer look. That's when he saw it. The fox's leg caught in a metal trap, blood staining the snow in dark streaks. "Easy now, little one," Ethan murmured, his voice low and soothing. Max stood by his side, growling softly but not advancing. Ethan crouched, extending a hand toward the fox. It let out a weak snarl but didn't retreat, perhaps understanding it had no other choice. With steady hands, Ethan removed the cruel trap, careful not to worsen the injury. Once freed, the fox collapsed into the snow. Trembling, gently, Ethan scooped it up and carried it inside. Max growled once more before settling back by the fire, his wary eyes never leaving the injured animal. Ethan placed the fox on an old blanket near the hearth, fetching bandages from a cabinet to treat its wound. The fox lay still, its eyes half closed as exhaustion overtook it. When the bandaging was done, Ethan returned to his chair, his gaze lingering on the small creature curled up by the fire. Outside, the storm's fury intensified, but inside the cabin, A fragile warmth prevailed. A strange sense of connection filled the room, a bond, however fleeting, between man and nature in the unforgiving embrace of winter. The snow continued to fall heavily, and the wind howled relentlessly around the small wooden cabin, testing the patience of anyone brave enough to endure it. Ethan Harper sat quietly by the fire, its flickering flames casting restless shadows across his face. The injured fox, now bandaged and lying curled on a blanket near the fire, stirred occasionally but had mostly drifted into an exhausted sleep. Max remained alert, his ears perked at every sound. The long winter night stretched on, and Ethan thought the day's strange events were finally behind him. But life in the wilderness was rarely predictable. A sudden noise broke the relative stillness, a deep, heavy sound of something large moving through the snow outside. Ethan's grip tightened instinctively around the flashlight on the table. Max immediately stood up, his gaze fixed on the window, a low growl rumbling in his throat. Ethan rose, his heartbeat quickening. He grabbed the flashlight and approached the window cautiously. Outside, the world was an endless sea of white, the only sound the howling wind. But as he switched on the flashlight and shone it through the frosted glass, the sight before him made him step back, his breath catching in his throat. A family of black bears stood not far from the cabin. The mother bear, imposing and dark against the snow, stood shielding 3 small cubs huddled at her feet. Shivering in the storm, Ethan's eyes locked on them, and his mind raced with every story he'd ever heard about the dangers of wild bears. Bears, especially a mother protecting her cubs, could become ferociously aggressive. A chill ran down his spine, but he couldn't look away from the mother bear's eyes. What struck him as odd was that the bear showed no signs of aggression. Her deep, dark eyes weren't those of a predator, but of a creature desperate and exhausted. She stood motionless, her body trembling against the icy winds, trying to shield her cubs. The 3 little ones clung to her legs, their small bodies quivering as they tried to withstand the storm's wrath. Ethan turned off the flashlight and stepped back from the window, his mind swirling. Bringing the bears inside? The idea was insane, but leaving them out there was a death sentence. The storm was too brutal, even for a creature as resilient as a bear. Hours passed as Ethan sat in his chair, staring at the window and wrestling with his thoughts. Max watched him intently, as if waiting for a decision. Ethan felt torn between logic and compassion. Letting a family of wild bears into his cabin was a risk, but the thought of leaving them to die weighed heavily on his conscience. Finally, Ethan stood, exhaling deeply as if releasing a heavy burden. He grabbed his rifle, not to harm but as a precaution, and opened the door. The icy wind rushed in, carrying snow onto the floor. Ethan stepped out, flashlight in hand, its beam once again illuminating the mother bear and her cubs. The bear stared at him, unmoving, raising his hand. Ethan spoke softly. "All right, if you want to survive tonight, I'll help, but we have to trust each other." He stepped back, leaving the door open. The mother bear hesitated, but when another fierce gust of wind blew through, she let out a low growl, signaling her cubs. The 3 little bears stumbled forward into the warmth of the cabin, followed closely by their mother. Ethan could feel his pulse pounding, but he held his ground. Once they were inside, Ethan shut the door, sealing out the storm. The mother bear settled in a corner, her wary eyes fixed on Ethan's every movement. Max growled softly but didn't approach. The room felt smaller and warmer, the air thick with a tense calm. Ethan added more wood to the fire, its glow spreading across the room. The bear family curled up near the fire, the cubs nestling close to their mother, their trembling slowly subsiding in the warmth. The mother bear let out a deep, rumbling sigh, a sound of exhaustion and gratitude. Ethan returned to his chair, Max lying at his feet, still watching their unexpected guests. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin, an unusual peace took hold. Ethan leaned back, watching the bear family drift into a quiet sleep. For the first time in years, He felt a profound connection to the wild, a fragile, fleeting bond of trust and survival in the unrelenting winter. The firelight spread warmth across the small cabin, warding off the icy darkness of the merciless winter storm raging outside. Ethan Harper sat in his chair, his eyes fixed on the black bear family huddled in the corner of the room. The cubs, their fur slick with ice and frost, had begun to relax as they absorbed the warmth. The mother bear lay beside them, her dark, deep eyes never leaving Ethan. She wasn't growling or aggressive, but her watchful gaze reminded Ethan to tread carefully. After a moment of hesitation, Ethan stood, moving toward the fireplace. Max, his loyal dog, whimpered softly but didn't rise. His eyes, like Ethan's, remained locked on the bear family, ready to react at the first sign of danger. Ethan reached for a thick blanket from a nearby shelf and carefully laid it out near the fire, close to where the bears were resting. He moved slowly, deliberately, ensuring his actions wouldn't be perceived as a threat. "You need to stay warm," he muttered, more to himself than to the bears. Taking a step back, he kept his eyes on the mother bear. The bear seemed to understand his intentions. She nudged her cubs gently, and after a moment of hesitation, the little ones shuffled onto the blanket. Once they settled, the mother bear lay down beside them, her massive body providing an additional layer of warmth and protection. Ethan exhaled a quiet sigh of relief, feeling a small measure of tension leave his body. As the fire began to dwindle, Ethan added more wood, ensuring the room remained a haven of warmth. Max, though more relaxed, stayed alert, his ears twitching at every sound. The room was quiet save for the crackling of the fire and the soft, rhythmic breathing of the bear cubs, watching the family curled up on the blanket. Ethan couldn't help but reflect on the harshness of the world outside. The storm was unrelenting, a reminder of how unforgiving nature could be. Yet here, within the walls of his humble cabin, he had created a fragile sanctuary. But warmth alone wouldn't be enough. The bears needed food, especially after enduring such a brutal ordeal in the cold. Ethan walked to the corner of the room where he kept his winter provisions. His small stockpile of nuts, dried vegetables, and other staples wasn't abundant, but it was enough to share. Ethan grabbed a small container and poured some nuts and dried carrots onto the floor, pushing the food toward the bears. "You must be hungry," he said softly, his voice gentle but wary. The mother bear lifted her head, her eyes studying Ethan carefully. For a moment, he felt his heart race, unsure of how she would respond. But there was no growl, no sign of aggression. Instead, she nudged her cubs forward. The little ones approached the food hesitantly, sniffing before they began eating hungrily. Ethan watched from his chair, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. He hadn't anticipated becoming a caretaker for wild bears. Yet here he was, sharing his home and supplies with them. Max glanced up at Ethan, as if to say, "Are you sure about this?" before resting his head back on his paws. Once the cubs had eaten their fill, they returned to their mother, curling up against her warm body. The mother bear seemed to relax even further, lowering her head and closing her eyes. Ethan leaned back in his chair, observing the peaceful scene with a mixture of awe and disbelief. In the dim glow of the fire, the mother bear opened her eyes once more, meeting Ethan's gaze. Her expression was different now, soft, almost grateful. There was no hint of fear or hostility, only trust. Ethan felt a warmth in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. In that silent exchange, he understood something profound. Despite their differences, they had found a way to coexist. However briefly, the storm continued to rage outside, but within the cabin, life persisted. Ethan closed his eyes, his mind filled with thoughts of connection and survival. His solitary life, once defined by isolation, now felt a little less lonely. Winter might be harsh and unforgiving, but amidst its brutality, it had forged an extraordinary bond between man and nature. one that would linger in Ethan's heart long after the snow had melted. The small wooden cabin, nestled deep within the snowy Rockies, had become an island of warmth amidst the raging winter storm outside. The wind howled and slammed against the thick timber walls, as though testing their strength against nature's fury. Yet inside, the atmosphere was entirely different. A golden glow from the fireplace spread across the room, casting soft shadows on old bookshelves, a weathered wooden table, and sturdy but worn chairs. The fire crackled and popped, blending with the smell of burning pine wood to create an environment of rare comfort and tranquility. The Bear family was no longer huddled fearfully in the corner as they had been when they first entered. The mother bear, majestic and imposing, lay curled up near the fire, her steady breaths blending with the rhythmic crackle of the flames. Her thick black fur, now dry and glistening, reflected the flickering light. Her deep, dark eyes occasionally opened to scan the room, but the wariness and tension they once held were gone. She seemed to have accepted that this warm haven was the safest place for her and her cubs during this deadly storm. The three cubs, unlike their calm and watchful mother, had grown curious. After eating their fill of nuts and dried vegetables that Ethan had shared, they ventured away from the blanket near the fire and began exploring the cabin. The smallest cub clambered onto a chair near the table, sniffing at its surface before rolling off with a comical thud. Drawing a soft chuckle from Ethan, another cub found its way to the corner where Ethan's thick winter boots were stored, pawing at the laces and tugging them playfully. The boldest of the three approached a bookshelf, standing on its hind legs and sniffing at the old, musty tomes with an inquisitive nose. Ethan sat at the wooden table near the window, silently observing the Bear family. The firelight danced across his weathered face, highlighting the furrowed lines of thought etched into his expression. His hand rested on the table, fingers drumming lightly as his mind wandered. Occasionally, his gaze shifted to the window, where the outside world was nothing but a swirling white void. The storm's winds howling like a relentless banshee. The decision to let the bears inside still gnawed at him. Inviting a wild bear family into his cabin was a risk he never thought he'd take. It went against every instinct and rule of wilderness survival he'd ever learned. Yet, as his eyes lingered on the playful cubs or the calm, trusting demeanor of the mother bear, he felt a sense of quiet validation. The cabin, once a space of solitude, was now alive with the sounds of life, the soft scrapes of bear paws against the wooden floor, the occasional whimper or sigh from Max, and the crackling of the fire. Ethan had lived in this cabin alone for years, but tonight, amidst the howling storm, it was filled with a sense of connection he hadn't realized he was missing. Max curled at Ethan's feet, occasionally opened his eyes to watch the cubs, his ears twitching at their every movement. The old dog, though still wary, seemed to have resigned himself to the situation, sensing no immediate danger from their unusual guests. Ethan glanced up at the ceiling, the sturdy beams that had weathered countless winters above him. Memories of past winters surfaced, seasons of silence, where the stillness of the cabin was a weight that pressed on him night after night. Now, that silence had been replaced by the gentle symphony of life. He hadn't expected the presence of a bear family to bring such a profound sense of comfort. One of the cubs suddenly rolled across the floor, bumping into a chair and causing it to wobble slightly. Ethan couldn't help but laugh softly, the sound breaking the stillness of the room. The mother bear opened her eyes, looking at him for a moment. Her gaze was calm, even tender, and Ethan nodded at her, a silent acknowledgement of their shared understanding. Outside, the storm raged on, its fury undiminished, but inside, a fragile peace reigned. It was a moment of rare serenity, a temporary truce between man and nature. Ethan realized that survival wasn't just about enduring the harshness of the world. It was also about connection and empathy, even if only for a fleeting moment. On the morning of the third day, after 2 long days of relentless snowstorms, sunlight finally pierced through the thick clouds. The first rays of light sparkled on the deep snow, transforming the world into a glittering, magical landscape. The snow reflected the sunlight like thousands of scattered diamonds, and the air, though still frigid, carried an unusual serenity, as if nature itself was exhaling after its tempestuous fury. Inside the small wooden cabin, the fireplace still burned softly, its warmth lingering in the room. The bear family remained curled up near the fire, the cubs sound asleep in a tangle of fur beside their mother. The mother bear, though still appearing weary, began to stir. She nudged her cubs gently, encouraging them to wake. Her deep, dark eyes, catching the morning light streaming through the window, seemed to convey a realization that it was time to leave. Ethan had risen early and stood by the window, gazing out at the transformed world. He noted the clear sky and the sparkling snow, a stark contrast to the storm's chaos just a day prior. The faint sound of birds echoed through the forest, their calls marking the storm's end. Ethan turned to look at the bear family, a mix of relief and melancholy washing over him. He knew their time in the cabin was coming to an end. The mother bear rose to her full height, her massive yet graceful form casting a long shadow in the firelight. She turned to Ethan, her gaze filled with a silent but profound message. Without words, Ethan understood. She was thanking him for opening his home, for sharing his food, and for giving her family a chance to survive the storm. The cubs, still groggy, tumbled off the blanket and yawned before scurrying to her side. Ethan remained in the corner, watching quietly, letting the bears move at their own pace. He felt an indescribable connection to them, a bond formed over the past few days of shared warmth and survival. He reflected on the moments they had shared, their playful curiosity, the mother bear's calm trust, and the sense of life they had brought into his solitary home. These memories would stay with him long after they were gone. The mother bear moved toward the door with deliberate steps, her movements steady but unhurried. Ethan stepped forward, opening the door to let the brilliant sunlight flood the cabin. The cold air rushed in, but it could not dispel the warmth in his heart. The mother bear paused at the threshold, turning her head to look back at Ethan one last time. She let out a soft, low growl, not of warning, but of gratitude. Ethan stood still, nodding slightly in acknowledgement. The cubs followed their mother, their small paw prints marking the fresh snow as they trailed behind her. They glanced back briefly, their bright eyes meeting Ethan's before they hurried to catch up. Ethan stood in the doorway, his hand resting lightly on the frame, watching as the bear family disappeared into the forest. Their tracks stretched across the snow, but he knew it wouldn't be long before the wind erased them, leaving no trace of their visit. As their figures vanished into the trees, silence enveloped the cabin once more. Ethan remained at the door, breathing in the crisp, fresh air and feeling the warmth of the sun on his face. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the experience sink in. This unexpected encounter, brief yet profound, had left an indelible mark on him. It wasn't just a story of survival. It was a lesson in compassion and connection between man and nature. Returning inside, the cabin felt emptier, but Ethan didn't feel lonely. He tidied up the blankets, rearranged the items the curious cubs had played with, and restored the room to its original state. Yet the space seemed warmer, as though it still held the lingering presence of his unexpected guests. Sitting back in his chair by the fire, Ethan stared into the dancing flames, feeling a different kind of warmth, a fire kindled not by wood, but by the extraordinary bond he had formed. The long winter ahead no longer seemed so desolate. He realized that amidst nature's harshness, it was these fragile, fleeting moments that gave life its true meaning.